Gantz from spiralinquiry.org, and we are continuing on our path of consilience, specifically
And
related to E.O.
our
Wilson's
host
book
today,
Consilience.
our host today, as usual, Daniel Sanderson from planksip.org. So thank you, Daniel, for hosting.
Thank you, George. Yeah. So we're jumping into chapter 8, and if I may, I think George, you gave me a couple books to look at. I've read one of them already, and this is, I think, to buttress such an important chapter 8. There's concepts like the Westermarck effect, which is the incest taboos that, according to Wilson, is one of the epigenetic and biological substrates that we have mapped cultural norms on and around. And so that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah. The title, the title of the chapter is The Fitness of Human Nature. So he's kind of expanding the old concept of evolution and fitness to a broader spectrum of not just sort of the basic biology of humans, but also to the sociology and the way they behave in groups, um, and linking that, as others have done, to the genes, the genetic evolution, the epigenetic triggering of the various genes under different circumstances, and then linking it to culture. So it's a big chapter, and it's got a great concept behind it.
Yeah. So I think if I can kind of guess where the foundation of some of your, not so much criticism, because you're not really, in a way, sometimes you are critical of maybe how far E.O. Wilson goes, but I'm going to offer a slight defense and wonder, and you let me know if this resonates with you a little bit, that Wilson has such a balance, like such a tightrope to balance in this kind of a conversation, because I think he's trying to balance a conversation from the scientific community with also the with culture on its own, without outwardly coming in and saying that, this book would be very different if he came out and said religion is absolutely necessary, start, begin, here we go, and da da da. It would have a completely different feel. But there's something that seems to be, from how you approach the criticism, that's exactly what's missing.
Well, it's let me put it this way: if you're an artist who is fundamentally devoted to expressing what goes on in your heart, in your art, and somebody comes along and says, "Well, your creativity is really based in your genes," it's it seems to be undermining what it is that they feel makes them human. So part of it is simply a language difference, and part is that someone coming from science is going to have a particular vocabulary that isn't going to resonate. And so I like the ideas that E.O. Wilson puts forward. Feels they need to be extended a bit to um, the world that exists beyond the empirical realm, um, and that we can talk about what that is, but to allow for that rather than simply you know cut it off. It's all physical. The genes and the epigenes derive the character. The character expresses itself, but it's really all about the genes. It's the same thing as saying, well, biology is nice, but it's really all about the physics. So part of it is languaging, and then part of it is the need to grasp a larger scale or a larger canvas to work on. And I think artists are a good example of their work. A lot of it is with ideas, expressions, and feelings, and touching things that are really outside of ourselves or bigger than ourselves. And that's the same thing that religion does. It tries to help us touch the things that are bigger and broader, and outside the scale, beyond the scale of what just, what empirical science has to offer. So part of it's languaging, and part of it's a lack of that scale, in my view.
Yeah, it makes me sigh in a way, because I think this is our key difference. And I'm not trying to eliminate religion, but in order for us to move into that same wonder and aesthetic and beauty that we get from religion, right?
Yep.
I feel we have to let go of those ghosts of that. Um, for example, if we look at ancient Greece and we look at the myths, I know it's a myth. Unfortunately, the way people handle religion today, it's not like a myth. There's not a plurality in it. There's the concept of belief, which can be transformative on the being, on the very existence of the individual. But religion has, what if we could have the best of both worlds? Leave the old parts of
Yeah.
religion in the past and move
Yeah.
religion into more of a synthesis
Yeah.
with science.
I'm in total agreement with you.
Okay.
And all I'm pointing out is that, yes, there's the baggage of dogma in religion. Um, and there's the baggage of dogma in science.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah.
So, we need to, be able to tell the difference between well-grounded principles, whether they're scientific or religious, spiritual, the well-grounded principles. We need to be able to filter those and get rid of the dogma. Now that's not an easy thing to do on either science or religion, because guess what? We're all human beings, and we have this tendency to be dogmatic and to grab hold of things that are simple answers, simple solutions. Tell me what to believe, and I'm all set. I don't have to think about it. Well, the human condition and the world of the creation itself is a lot more nuanced than that, and a lot more open-ended than that. The other way to think about it is that, in some sense, the empirical is looking at the experience from inside of the physical world, so that's what it sees. Uh, a spiritual perspective is an attempt to look at that from the outside, outside of the body, outside of the physical, and yet the great truths in religion, I think, are consistent with the great truths in science,
Mm.
but not the science of a century ago, which was deterministic, mechanistic,
Yeah.
and a lot of the language we have around people, just kind of becoming this mechanized, the brain is a machine, an algorithm, all of that stuff. Well, all of that's old dogmatic rhetoric that's not consistent with the latest findings in science, which are a lot more open-ended than that, and a lot more, frankly, exposed to the mysteries of creation than the science of 100 years ago. So, yeah, I agree with the idea that, both spiritual viewpoints, empirical viewpoints, we need to get rid of the dogma. We need to identify and get rid of the dogma, um, and find a way to synthesize the knowledge, the efforts to acquire knowledge empirically, and the efforts to acquire knowledge spiritually. Let's integrate them. You know, so
Yeah.
that's yeah. Anyway, that's great, great question, great observation, and this is really kind of goes to the heart of the effort to knit together things that are, that from both perspectives, both the religious perspective and the scientific perspective, tend to be, you know, not interested in the conversation across the divide. Well, that's it. That's too much. There are a lot of scientists and a lot of religious thinkers that are, quite capable of balancing the two. I think some of the Templeton Prize winners, Martin Rees was a winner of the Templeton Prize. John Polkinghorne, a great mind in physics and also a great leader in the great religious leader. So, there's some very exceptional people that have been able to cross that divide and comfortably.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm open to that. I think I've softened, at least on my approach with religious leaders and thinkers. And in doing so, I mean, I may use a heuristic for good versus God. I may, take the word of outside of yourself and put it into imagination, right? I mean, if you base
Mm-hmm.
social policy as an example entirely on empirical data, it's only inductive reasoning based off of you know things that have already happened,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Yeah,
um,
last week we talked about the limits of inductive reasoning too, because
yeah,
you're taking a leap, if you will. You could call it a leap of faith from a sample that you've examined and identified, and then generalizing it to the rest of the universe that you haven't examined, because you can't examine everything. So you leap from observation of a population of a sample, excuse me, and generalize it to a population. And if you really believe what you say, you've made a leap of faith. You've gone from, well, I have five. I've got I've observed this number. Even if it's a percentage or a probability, I've observed a certain probability, and you know what, it looks good to me, so I'm going to believe that this applies, to the entire population. Well, that's an act of faith to adopt that belief. It's based on an inductive generalization that's pretty good. And as Mark Lang would say, there's validation, there's good validation, there's good, but you cannot validate every instance of every, um, you know, uh, example of something. It's just not, you can't do it. You can't validate it. So there's always an open question. So that's another dimension to this in terms of getting rid of dogma from both the science side and the religious side, you know, and also just hold on to a little bit of doubt, because
yeah,
you're doing the
absolutely.
best. We're human beings. We're doing the best. And you know what? We could be wrong.
Well, the thing is that the way I look at it is that eusociality, right? It says a social animal is a complex system. That's what it is. It's a complex system, and religion is society's attempt to put a framework in place to describe that. Now, I've been talking to a few religious colleagues who, for example, um, talk about the emphasis of the individual. And one of the things, I mean, you've heard of the concept that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And so something transformative happens in a group setting. I mean, Wilson would be, he's saying that anyways, at least in the, we'll use some terminology here just so that we can have some common ground. The leap of faith, right, that you're talking about is that he's testing a theory of group selection, which is
Mhm.
very contentious still to this day, of whether altruistic groups in game theory actually prevail over individualistic selfish needs,
Yeah, well,
right? I
that's
mean,
an old debate, and the
yeah,
debate, to my mind, if you look at the recent writings of the best minds, is it's no longer a debate. I mean,
okay,
you can deny climate change, but that climate change is real. you can deny multi-level group selection, but the preponderance of the consensus is that, yeah, this is what works.
Mm.
And and there are lots of books about it. As a matter of fact, uh, this is one that we
Well,
talk a
before
little
we
bit
get there, because
about.
I want to
Yeah,
talk about that for a minute,
yeah.
because I was definitely on that side, but a quick Wikipedia lookup, and for sure, go ahead and viewers do look that up on group selection.
Hmm.
There's towards the bottom of the Wikipedia listing, there's somebody that's in opposition to that, and
Oh,
fairly
of course, of course,
right,
of
but
course. And
very. And
that
so if
doesn't
it is,
mean, yeah. So
well,
in any discussion like Wikipedia or a journalist exploring, this side, that side, you know, you're going to do a fair job of presenting both sides, but
mm,
you don't that doesn't reflect the consensus or the preponderance, because you know if you have two sides, and I think sociality as a driver of social structures and evolution of social structures is one of those things that, yeah, it used to be a renegade concept where the preponderance of the consensus was, nah, that doesn't really work. And then that began to shift as new evidence and new arguments come up, and so then it became more
mhm,
balanced. Now I think you'd find that the preponderance of those practicing and discussing, E.O. Wilson included, really think multi-level group selection is validated, and it's the right way to think about the evolution of human beings in the context of social systems. And there are lots of examples in the animal world and the insect world, which is probably why E.O. Wilson was kind of a leader in this conversation, that validates that. So yeah, Wikipedia is going to show you, well, there's this view, and then there's also this view, and they might even say, well, this is a minority view. But that is, in my view, given my reading, that's really shifted. And
mhm.
those that are really holding on to the you know uh, even the characterization of it as the selfish gene, it's the one driver, and ignores the concept of multi-level group selection. I don't think that's very common anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. But what I was in the same boat that you were in, but you revisit information again. There's a little bit of a cognitive fall off on memory, on concepts. You always go back, you refresh it, you think, bring
Yeah,
yourself up to speed with the argument or with, yeah, with the
yeah,
language.
yeah,
And then you see that, and then I go, well, man, am I, and I don't have a way to reconcile what in the scientific community like climate change. Let's take that for example. We know that it's like a 99% consensus, like very, very high
hmm,
consensus. I mean, I'm
hmm,
even sick of even having a two-sided argument about it anymore, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
what kind of evidence do we need? The extinguished humanity before we.
yeah,
So it
yeah,
just it gets ridiculous, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's like the flat Earth. People that believe in the flat and there is flat. It's like, well, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But actually, I just made a post this past week about that, because there are people that will hold on to absurd beliefs, and I don't think it's because they're necessarily ideologue, but because it's more fun, more. They can be a counter. They can express something about how they're different by holding
Yeah.
on to an absurd belief. So I think this holding on to fantasy, there's a reason people will hold on to these fantasies, even though on some level they've got to recognize the absurdity of it, but they'll hold on to it just because it makes them look different, or it makes them look special, or they've got this, conspiracy theories is all about the inside. I've got this special knowledge, so I'm special.
you know I'll show you some few things that are really interesting. I'm talking to a religious, not a religious leader, but I was talking about some religious terms, and the term wrath came up.
Hmm.
And so wrath was something that would be experienced by the perversion and that direction from the individual trying to stake claim on the individuality that is antithetical with truth, right? And we just say we don't necessarily have the absolute truth, but we
Yeah.
know that this is the way it is. So
Yeah.
to maintain and anchor a point in something that you know to be true, not to be true, but you're doing it just for attention. Social media could be a really
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
example of this.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like people react in anger because, what do you mean flat earth? Of course I'm going to respond to that. And
Yeah.
you get
Yeah.
lots of engagement and all this sort of thing. Well, that's the problem. And
Yeah.
according
Yeah.
to the religious terminology and the wisdom, so let's talk about the wisdom that emerges from this concept of wrath. That's something that will penetrate your soul, will eat you from the inside. It's like horrific to the group. It undermines norms. It's completely destructive to society, right? And
Yeah.
and religion's going, guys, no. Here, the dogma for truth and goodness is actually good. So get in line and stop trying to individuate here.
Right.
Like fall in line.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you packed a lot into that, and I think uh, culture, as it evolves to promote the welfare of the public, human culture is trying to make things better for people. That's why people buy into it. And culture has a way of dealing with um, um, the people who don't buy in, the nonconformists. And you look at history. Some of that behavior on the part of culture dealing with nonconformists was pretty awful. Um, Punishing the nonconformists for not complying with the collective views. And but if you think about a tribe that's trying desperately to survive, passing knowledge down through oral histories, you know, compliance is incredibly important. Think of multi-generational knowledge, which hey, we revere that volcano, that mountain. We don't go there. We have taboos. We have you know cultural constructs around the angry wrath of the gods, and because the collective wisdom knows that every couple of hundred years the thing blows its stack and everybody near it dies. So there's a cultural wisdom that gets built into the mythologies, and there will be a a consequence, a social consequence of somebody that wants to go against it. So historically, I think humans have had strong social norms, um, much of which has been developed out of cultural knowledge that's accumulated over generations, and it's got a positive survival characteristic to it. Um, and it had norms built, it had methods built in to punish those who weren't following the norms. So, as individuals, we think, oh, that's bad, it's coercive. But if you look at it from a social standpoint or a eusociality standpoint, you see, well, there's a survival benefit there to the culture, to be able to help in, deal with multi-generational knowledge passing down through oral histories. That's the way it was for so many hundreds of thousands of years. So you had to have a mechanism like that at work. So now we're in a world where those cultural norms and the enforcement of those cultural norms is loosened significantly. Positive benefits for individual freedoms, the individual to express themselves, freedom of speech. Um, but with the explosion of the media that's been allowing people to get these platforms where they can say ridiculous things, have no consequences, or even the consequences are positive. You say these ridiculous things in social media, you get a lot of hits, you get a lot of
Yeah.
visits, you become a celebrity, and so we're kind of our culture is sort of unmoored from the cultural framework that keeps you in line with, ridiculous beliefs or statements, that's no longer really operating. And if you don't face the consequences from saying ridiculous things that aren't grounded in reality, have no consequences or even positive results. So that's part of what's going on with climate denial and conspiracy theories. It's just you can get more notoriety, you can get more hits by saying these outrageous things, and you don't have any consequences. So, and then in the final analysis, we can fool ourselves. If we're getting a benefit out of thinking and talking in a certain way, we can fool ourselves that you know that's good. So I just covered a lot of territory there too. So, anything you react to any of that?
No, it all makes sense. I actually think we can move on to your book selections. I think would be
Yeah,
we're 25 minutes into the into the show, so I think we should get to some of the livres.
yeah. Well, you started it because
I
you
know. I
use the
just
word use the word you
I'll let
sociality,
you have
which
the
is
last word. That's good. I'm a gracious host. I'm
sociality,
Canadian. I'm
which
always
is
polite.
the kind of the groupiness of human beings.
Yeah.
And for a long time, that was felt to be outside of human nature was God given. It fell outside of the realm of evolutionary tendencies and that sort of stuff. So it was walled off, if you will, from evolutionary science, and that's gone.
Mm.
And multi-level group selection is one of the examples that is now a common consensus. And then that gets extended when you read things like Nicholas Christakis' blueprint. I have to go backwards here. The evolutionary origins of a good society. And this sort of takes off on what E.O. Wilson was talking about. Humans have these genes. They enable the development of these social relations among human beings. Empathy is a part of that. Groups, your kin, you're biologically related to. All of these things are have an evolutionary component to it. And the example you gave at the start of the taboo on incest.
Mhm.
So there's a cultural taboo pretty much across the board in ancient and modern cultures against incest. Well, and there's a biological consequence of inbreeding that shows up whenever populations are either forced to or do do inbreeding. I think the European monarchy was acknowledged to be inbreeding and ended up with a strong threat of hemophilia, which is one of the things that negative consequence. And the same thing would happen with populations. Animals is a good example. The inbreeding of dogs because people like certain breeds, and that inbreeding has resulted in breeds that have physiological frailties because of
Yeah.
the relatively inadequate genetic stock to have that breadth. So
I call
I
that
don't know where I'm
domestic
going with that.
abuse.
What's that?
I call that domestic abuse
Yeah,
in the writings, right? I mean,
yeah,
not a
yeah,
downplay on a
yeah,
physical abuse of partners and such, but it's just horrific to me that we do this for our own amusement in a way, right? Like,
yeah,
and there's people oblivious to it because they love their animals, they love their pets, but realizing we've created a whole variation of a canine species that
yeah,
struggles and has
yeah,
atomical features that are just and health and problems breathing, and it's like, what is wrong with us? Like, why
yeah,
what is wrong with us?
yeah, yeah.
Like
Well,
domestic abuse.
I think the ethics have been changing as we've
Yeah,
started to wake up to the fact that hey, guess what? Animals suffer. Animals
yeah,
are conscious. Animals suffer.
yeah,
And you can extend that in my view, to even a spiritualist side and saying, to the extent you are conscious and you suffer, you have a spiritual life. And, so, I mean, it used to be, well, only humans have souls, right? Well, you know, um, I think you can look at it quite differently now and think about every living thing has part of a soul or some aspect of soulfulness that should be acknowledged. Anyway, that's a kind of a sidebar. We should talk about Michael Pollan someday in one of our conversations and his writings.
Mm.
About the changes in the biological world, or the biomass assessment, which is about how humans have so uh, and just overwhelmed the genetic stock of
Yeah.
so many species through its the selection pressures that's applied to those species. But I wanted to get back to
Yep.
eusociality, because this is a level of where the individual human interacting with other humans is a part of what sort of develops the relationships among humans. But groups, as you say, is a complex system, and that complex system develops characteristics that are um, different from and go beyond just person to person. And that Nicholas Christakis calls those tendencies, he calls the social suite. It's a
Mm.
suite of characteristics in terms of human tendency to create groups, loyalty within groups, affection within groups, that takes it beyond just person to person, brings it across to the group level, and then follows what happens to different groups that have different practices. Well, there's a selection process,
Mm.
and those groups that have been successful and have gone from tribes, and then it evolved to cities and kingdoms and empires and global. Those groups that have been successful and done that are the ones that really capture and exhibit the social suite of positive uh, social empathy, compassion, love, loyalty, um, those good aspects, what we think of as the good virtues, really, the Greek virtues of the individual, reflecting their commitment to the broader good. Those are the elements of the social suite that have allowed humanity to just explode out of the forests and into agriculture, and from agriculture to trade, and from trade to science. And here we are in the 21st century, and it's all built upon a fixed set of genetic and epigenetic characteristics that were founded through the biological evolution of the species, and then the cultural evolution of the civilization, to get where it is today. So I think it's a wonderful story. This is kind of the epic story of the evolution from a single cell to the multi-cell to the spreading across the earth, and then the creation of intelligent sentient beings that are then able to take evolution to a different level, and you know um, fill the planet with greater intelligence and greater consciousness. And of course, we've also made mistakes in the process, and that's the downside, that downside of it. So E.O. Wilson was kind of committed to that concept of seeing the evolution of this civilization, and drilling it down in his reductionist way to the individual, and then the individual to the genes and the epigenetic process by which that individual evolves. Um, I did have an analogy that might be helpful. Uh, Consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, according to Chalmers, is that we've got all this stuff going on in the brain, and you can look at all the different pieces of it, and he thinks you can address it from kind of the mechanical, the biomechanical, and the states of the brain, and all of that is subject to analysis, and we can explain it all eventually, except for qualia, which is the experiencing of the stuff that goes on in the body. And now let's talk about humans relating to each other, culture developing.
Well, before I want to bring a
Yeah,
good point.
let me just finish the metaphor. So the cultural evolution, or the evolution of a civilization through these kinds of pressures that Wilson and Christakis are talking about, yeah, you can explain it all, but at the very end of the day, something is going on that is analogous to qualia. Qualia and consciousness is analogous to spirituality in human experience.
Period. Okay. All right. Yeah, it wasn't what came to my mind, actually. It was there was two examples that I think really counterpoint those claims of what qualia is, right? So, for example, the experience of color. This gets into the conversation of empirical conversations to say what's the experience of blue? What's the experience of taste? Mm-hmm. Right now, we can describe it, biologically what's going on, but we can explain it in a way that's not fully captured by, the language of science, and that's kind of the point, right? And so that's the one example that I think gets closest to the scientific literature that says, yeah, okay, we can do studies on taste, we can do studies on color, right? But how do you describe the experience? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the point. Now, I didn't bring anything religious into there.
Yeah. No, that was my metaphor, my analogy to, individual consciousness, your cells all combine together, there's stuff firing off in this massive gooey stuff inside your cranium, and there is a lot of, as you can explain this, that, and the other thing, but at the end of the day, you have quality. You have the experience of experiencing something and recognizing your experience to something, which, Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. Well, I'm posing that there is a hard problem of cultural evolutionary development, the pinnacle of the pinnacle of human evolutionary dynamics in the institutions and the culture that's been created. There's a cultural meme. Well, okay, so build that framework out a little bit, and the pinnacle of that, and the thing that cannot be the hard problem of civilization, is the spiritual experience. Like for a human consciousness, it's qualia. For understanding civilizations, it's the spiritual.
So now I would fill in that blank with abstract thought, and spiritual doesn't fill that void for me, right? Like, I mean, abstract thought is as vast as any known conceptualization of God and every unknown conceptualization of God. Imagination is it. So for me, I'm looking at it going, that encapsulates everything. And if I can say it also encapsulates the experience, the beauty, the wonder, like I was talking to a religious friend of mine, and he said, yeah, but, and it does. He's kind of pulling it your way a little bit, right? And I say, but the issue is that if we have a society like that acknowledges say a religious fundamentalism, even if it's a pragmatic sort of fundamentalism, I'm going, if you divided the country into east, west, up, down, whatever you wanted to do, and said, those people over here, we're over here. We choose to live by these norms. We're going to do this. And I'm going to be like, and I said to him, am I invited to the party of the religious folk? Because I'm like, I hope I would be, but there's very distinct lines for me.
Yeah, I don't have that same sense of lines on uh, religious conviction, because I see, uh, I recognize and acknowledge significant value in holding to certain fundamental religious beliefs. Um, and but that's not the same thing as dogma, because
Right.
dogma is something different than spiritual. So I appreciate what you're saying, and it's clear that there's something that I'm feeling about the concept of spirituality and religion, that isn't resonating with you, and that's okay, because I think we are in agreement about what's important in human behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I
and
mean, yeah,
and you've come to that from a examination of the empirical world, the teachings of science, the teachings of normative ethics in Western civilization, which, by the way, are grounded in religious principles, but that's back to a different book. Um, and I see a grounding that an added layer to that grounding that
mm,
goes to a universal, an infinite universal, and the fact that we have the same set of behavioral rules is great. So we can both support that, and you're welcome to my party, and I'm sure I'm welcome to your party.
good. Yeah, we'll have like,
Although we're a continent apart, but
yeah, it's interesting and it's rich. That culture and that religion is very rich in
no.
terms of wisdom,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm interested in exploring.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not afraid to pick up the Bible and Old or New
Yeah.
Testament. I'm not afraid to do that and look at it and see the value of what's in there.
Yeah.
Right? Um, yeah, just kind of leave it at that. But I, of course, like you, I've got a rich mind, or like a rich yearning to try and discover other aspects of like the
Yeah.
scientific body of knowledge and other literature,
Yeah.
because you're closer to me than a religious fundamentalist that would say, no, no, you don't need any other book except for the Bible, and there is a pragmatic truth in that, George. If you would just stay to the Bible and read nothing else, you would be a better person, and society would be a better society, right? And that, I'm like, well, I
Yeah.
don't
No, I
know.
don't. I don't buy that, because that's taking. Uh, can't think of a good analogy, but it's like uh, there's a universal spiritual flow, in my opinion, my belief, that manifests. And by the way, the infinite quality of the spiritual flow is an important feature of it. And you know, any anything infinite is going to have lots of different faces, lots of different expressions, lots of different metaphors. And for anyone who is adopting the metaphor or the picture or the particularity of a facet, if you will, of that expression of the infinite that doesn't recognize there are other expressions of the infinite, um, I think they're making a mistake. And it's going outside of, the comfortable construct that they've grown up with to something that, that opens a door to something bigger and broader. Well, that can be, you know, pretty scary and threatening to, the norms and threatening to the background. So, I can understand people not wanting to go there, but uh, I don't know that it's fair to exclude, to look at the different religious traditions and the different ways of conceptualizing the infinite, and and the source of creation, uh, and putting a pin on it and saying, well, this is the one.
Yeah.
My view
Yeah.
is the one. I mean, that's a dogma, just in the same way that a scientist saying, well, I'm
Yeah.
right. It's so, and that's why there's a my belief set is something that has a universality to it. Uh, and The other thing is religions can sometimes take a certain set of precepts, and then that came out of a cultural time and place, and then impose it in a different time and place where it's not really appropriate or necessary. It's just sort of a baggage that's being carried along with the belief set of the culture that's really not evolutionary useful anymore. Um, One of the examples is I respect Jewish people that follow kosher traditions in terms of foodstuffs, but um, you know, under modern agriculture and husbandry traditions and oversights and regulation and all the rest of the stuff, those were derived in a point in time in history when survival of the tribe was dependent upon not getting poisoned by spoiled food or other kinds of things. Oh, and by the way, that's another interesting little taboo. The taboo of incest has biological consequences too. Well, the taboo against what is it when you eat human flesh? Cannibalism. The taboo against cannibalism also has significant biological consequences,
Mm.
because they've found that the problem of the twisted prions in the brain,
Mm.
what was that disease called? The mad cow disease that came out, a while back. Well, that's a biological consequence of mixing the genetic materials of your own species,
Wow.
into your digestive system. Things can go wrong. So that's another taboo that has some interesting biological basis to it. So that's a taboo that we want to hold on to.
Yeah, I never knew that
Incest
actually.
incest is a taboo that we want to hold on to, but the restrictions on eating pork, for example. Well, and I know some Reform Jews that will sort of say, well, that's one of those things that yeah, it's there in the culture, but it doesn't have the same value and importance to the culture that it had as it had 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, interesting. I
yeah.
mean, is there a small amount of orthodoxy and claims that could say, well, it allows us to hold on to the stories about that history in a way
Oh,
that
yeah,
is right? So I can understand that too, right?
yeah,
I can
yeah,
understand that defense and I can go, okay, yeah, I get it.
yeah. But don't try to impose that on other people.
Exactly. Yeah.
With other cultural backgrounds, with other traditions, and but recognize the value it has to you as a ritual practice, which, by the way, ritual practice is also a part of the human experience that has been largely thrown out by modern individualistic secular culture.
Yeah.
So there's something that had great value and sustenance to humans over millennia that in the modern age has kind of been tossed out and relegated to relegated to the superstition bucket, and yet it's missing what ritual, the impact that ritual has on, on the body and mind of an individual that's engaging in that ritual. It can have very, very powerful positive physiological, prayer is a good example, the physiological benefit. They talk about meditation and the benefits of meditation in the
Yeah.
body and the parasympathetic. Well, that's what prayer is. So,
Yeah.
so uh, you can look at prayer as something that, okay, has some good biological, physiological characteristics to it in terms of benefits. Um, that doesn't mean you need to believe in the efficacy of petitionary prayer, right? So that's
Yeah.
one where you can talk about miracles you know in a way. You have to be very careful about how you talk about miracles, because um, this is a very complicated subject, and I tend to think of miracles from the standpoint of things that can fit into the scientific framework acceptably, and also uh, come into the from the human experiential side of it. So there doesn't have to be a conflict. It's, I mean, I believe in miracles, but not the kind that are going to be, you know, a God coming down and changing the laws of physics for an instant. That
Mm.
doesn't work. But anyway, complicated. A lot of different threads there. I did want to mention this.
Okay.
Um, Great book by Robert Wright, The Evolution of God. And Robert Wright is not a religious man, and
Okay.
he asserts that he's at 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 best agnostic. He would consider himself agnostic, not taking a position on the religious principles. But he's looking at religion from the standpoint of its features of how it has evolved along with the human culture and an accompaniment to the human culture and civilizations, that have evolved. And one of the points he makes is that, there was a significant transition in the human species from Paleolithic to agricultural bases, and that went along with a change in the way the way religion expressed itself in those cultures. And there's another one, I don't remember who it is, who pointed out that, complicated city-state societies couldn't rely on the simple sense of individual trust that you'd have in a tribe. So
Right.
they had to invent something that, something evolved that would help make a very large group of people um, um, get along and follow sets of rules and prescriptions, and do so with an understanding, that this is tied to something greater. So empire, the kings that became affiliate of, sort of the state, religion and state kind of combined, because that was an efficient way of operating a much larger unit of humans than just the tribes. And then as the global society began to recognize itself, this points to about 2,000 years or so ago, when, explorers and, the knowledge about the existence of the world in a broader sense was becoming more available. Then there was another leap in the evolution of religions to the monotheistic religions that created the context and space within which human civilization would be able to take another evolutionary leap forward. Um, so the religion was a supportive instrument for humans to build more successful, more complex, more interrelated societies. And here we are in the 21st century, where a lot of the the society has again taken an evolutionary step, and the kind of religion that we need to move successfully into the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th century still hasn't evolved itself. And I think that's where a universalistic concept, James Lovelock, the Gaia hypothesis sort of fits into the concept of thinking about all of us as one, all of us on, on this single organism. All of us have an obligation to work together. All of us have this obligation to be committed to the whole. Those are the kind of religious or spiritual concepts that the civilization probably needs to be able to successfully navigate, into a advanced global civilization. No, we're not there yet. So I think that was a great book. I recommend it. It's a good one.
Yeah. Well, I think we're approaching we've gone past the tip of the hour, and I think today was a tight timeline for you. So
Yep.
on that, I think it was a good way to wrap up the end of the show. And George, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah,
And
it's great, Daniel. You push on certain things, and then it's like the conversation just explodes into these areas. So I really think you know, we're on that cutting edge, and it's a great place to be. I love the conversation. Thank you.
yeah, same here. So next week, chapter 9, and we'll just keep plugging away and appreciate it. Thanks, George. I really,
Thank you.
really do
Thanks,
appreciate it.
everybody.